Hello, and thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar. We're so thrilled to have such great interest in this webinar, and I'm not surprised because we've got a fantastic panel for you today. Today's webinar is called Celebrating Women, Balanced Engagement for Equitable Plans. We want to reach out and thank WTS, a wonderful international organization celebrating women in transportation, for co-sponsoring today's webinar. Also, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, and the American Planning Association, and in particular, the American Planning Association Division on Women in Planning, for co-sponsoring today's webinar. Really appreciate those sponsorships, and let's begin. My name is Dave Biggs, and I'm pleased to be your host today. And I'm the Chief Engagement Officer here at MetroQuest, and it's a great pleasure to be working with so many fantastic women in planning, and watching the work that they do is a real honor for me. We're going to look today at women in planning from three interesting perspectives. First, we're going to examine women in leadership positions in planning organizations and how important that is and the difference that they make. Then we're going to look at engaging women in the planning exercise, so engaging the public in the planning exercise and the important perspective women and other difficult to reach populations bring to the planning process. And then we're going to turn to equity considerations and looking specifically at how women's needs in terms of mobility and livability of cities differ from the general population, and the difference it makes in looking at different demographics and their needs in the planning process. Before we go through the agenda, I want to congratulate the 29 women that last year were inducted into the Fellows of the AICP, the American Institute of Certified Planners last year. Just so thrilled at their accomplishments, and congratulations to all of them. So the agenda today, we're going to start by celebrating women in leadership positions in planning, and then we're going to move on to examining a case study where there was great balance achieved across different demographic groups, including women, and the difference it made in the engagement process and how those people were engaged and what strategies were most effective. And then we're going to examine what planning a FEMOPOLIS is all about. And then I'm going to come back on after our three panelists, and I'm going to talk about some of the best practices that we've learned in terms of optimizing online engagement to achieve balance in the participation. And then we're going to open it up for live Q&A. If you have questions throughout the webinar for any of our panelists, don't hesitate to use the GoToWebinar panel on questions. Type in your question and we'll get to as many of those as possible during the live webinar. And if we don't get to your question, we'll get to it in the follow-up after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel. It's such a great pleasure to work with so many awesome women in this industry. I'm going to start with Beth Alden, who is the MPO Executive Director for the Hillsborough MPO, and she's going to share her perspective on leadership and women in planning. And then I'm going to turn it over to Liane Miller, who is the Planning and Policy Manager at the City of Austin, who's going to talk about her efforts and success in engaging women in the planning process and how she achieved that balance. And then we're going to hear from Jennifer Fix, who is a Senior Planner at DIALOG, and she's going to talk about a concept that she's coined called FEMOPOLIS, and talk about the importance of equity in planning decisions that happen in our urban environments. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Beth. So Beth is the Executive Director at the Hillsborough MPO, and I wanted to get her perspective on how women can move cities and transportation forward in powerful ways. So Beth's going to talk to us a little bit about her journey to Executive Director. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Beth. So Beth, are you there?
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you loud and clear. Take it away, Beth.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little about my path, and I have to say that there have been a lot of strong women leaders who came before me and moved the needle a lot in helping women's voices be heard. But it's always a challenge. You've probably heard that the first rule of leadership is that everything is your fault. And sometimes that joke does land on women kind of heavily. But going back just a little, when I started my career, it was just a few years after Tampa elected its first woman mayor. She was the first woman of 55 mayors, and Tampa was still a boys' town in a lot of ways. And in the news, football was hot, and the decline of the local mafia dragged on. At my first job, I was informed that I was privileged to participate in functions at the University Club of Tampa, where a lot of political talks were hosted, because women had not been allowed to become members before Mayor Friedman was elected just a few years before. I also remember watching one of the county commissioners refer to an accomplished and super smart female planning director as that little girl on camera, and more than once, particularly when he didn't support her recommendations. And when I went to a training class on computer programs for traffic simulation in 1999, I was one of 2 female students in a large room, and the instructor suggested that I present my work to the rest of the class in a bikini. He suggested this in front of the whole class, and I'm sure he thought he was being funny. Belittling women's professional capacity and dismissing their perspectives doesn't just do a disservice to women. It also reduces by half the pool of good ideas that are available for consideration by any group. And our communities have enough challenges. We need all the good ideas we can get. So I wanted to share this survey of workplace dynamics with respect to women in planning. The 2 columns here show responses from people in planning workplaces that have men in leadership and women in leadership. And people in those workplaces report that men are heard more in both cases, but maybe a little less in workplaces with women in leadership. That with women in leadership, gender equality concerns are taken a little more seriously, and there's more equality in pay and opportunities for advancement. And also that with women in leadership, flex time is more encouraged, which helps with work-life balance, not only for women, but also for men. I was fortunate that my employer supported equal opportunities for advancement. And I was promoted to team leader after about 5 years and to assistant executive director after about 10. This slide is a little spotlight that the local Museum of Science and Industry created about me and a few other local professionals who are working in air quality. The executive director that I worked for, to whom I was the assistant, I was really lucky that he was a great mentor, and he had some words of wisdom that have stuck with me, such as, you have to tell the truth even when it isn't popular, and even when we aren't enjoying hearing it ourselves. And don't surround yourself with people who are just like you, because they won't be able to tell you about the many things that you haven't thought of. So I've been the beneficiary of that kind of inclusive thinking, and I try to pay it forward. Applying that principle to the transportation planning that my agency is responsible for means bringing more voices into the planning process. So we've worked hard to get opinion surveys in front of people from a lot of different walks of life in our area. This is one example. It was a gamified survey that we used in 2014, and we brought it to neighborhood group meetings, community events, recreation centers, shopping malls, any place that would have us, and many groups that we reached out to proactively. It had a huge response, and even more importantly, it reshaped our transportation funding priorities as we came out of the Great Recession. There are a lot of performance metrics in transportation planning, and of course you get what you measure. Focusing on roadway level of service measures, for example, leads us into a spiral of road widening and induced sprawl that we can't afford in the long run, as planners have been documenting for generations now. It also, though, siphons resources away from the basic investments that working families need and that we heard about from our citizens when we did that extensive outreach. So things like fixing potholes, disaster preparedness, safe streets and sidewalks, responsive traffic signals, and bus service that runs more often than once an hour. Those are all things that our community has been telling us are important. And changing the measures and changing the conversation about what's important helps us help decision makers reorient the funding priorities. So you may have heard that Tampa is high on the dangerous by design list of high crash areas. And locally, we've talked about safety being a top priority for decades. What we used to mean by that was that we would give extra prioritization points to road widening projects where there's a crash problem. Unfortunately, widening roads doesn't always make them safer, and we weren't focusing on the fundamental safety problems, which require a holistic look. We have a high crash rate because our city has grown up around multi-lane, high-speed commercial strip roadways. And there are neighborhoods on both sides of these roads with people who rely on their feet and the bus to get them to work and groceries and daycare and healthcare. And in many places, the signalized crosswalks are spaced a half a mile apart. And they don't line up with the bus stops or the schools or the grocery marts. These are big systemic problems that we can't solve by ourselves. But I'm very blessed to have some fabulous women on my team who have stepped in to create and lead coalitions that are tackling these challenges. So one you see here is Gina Torres. She's working on a vision of zero traffic deaths, which is obviously an ambitious goal, but it's attracted people who have never participated in our planning before. And it's different because it draws a line in the sand, asking how many deaths are acceptable, how many deaths in your neighborhood are acceptable. And we have to change our fundamental approach to planning if we want a different outcome. It will also take a village to change our public health outcomes in our county. And leading the way is another one of my fabulous female planners, Michelle Ogilvie, who recently won a grant from the American Public Health Association to help expand community gardens in food desert areas and expand walk and bike access to them. I also wanted to tell you about my planner, Lisa Silva, who is working on a group called the School Transportation Working Group to focus on areas around our public schools, not only the driving access, but the walk and bike access. And again, bringing together a whole coalition of people to try to address these systemic challenges around schools. And I'm also very lucky to have Allison Ye on my team, who has been focusing on Tampa's vulnerability to major storms and sea level rise. And again, putting together a coalition of agencies and stakeholders to try to reduce our transportation system's vulnerability and our ability to rebound after a major disaster. But like everyone, we do have failures in our planning sometimes. A few years ago, we had a project called Tampa Bay Express, or TBX, which was a proposal for express toll lanes through the heart of Tampa. And we heard a lot from members of our community that they didn't find this proposal acceptable. In fact, we had a public hearing in June of 2016 that finally adjourned at 2:30 in the morning after more than 400 comments were received. The word cloud that you see here actually reflects some of those comments. The Department of Transportation did put the project on hold, and the next steps that came out of that came out of the collaboration of women and men in a bunch of different agencies and community groups. So you see here a photo of some of them on a tour bus where they were actually going and visiting the neighborhoods that would be affected by the Express Toll Lane project. And right in front in yellow is Miss Chloe Coney, the woman of many hats who founded the East Tampa Community Development Corporation. And she has helped turn around the conversation about this project, not only how it's designed and how it will affect the neighborhoods, but also opportunities for workforce development for the people who live in those neighborhoods. And part of this has come about, some of this transformation about this major project through Tampa. Part of that has come about through the collaboration of a network of women at all of the agencies that have to work together for our transportation systems in Tampa Bay. And this is just one snapshot of some of these great women that I'm lucky to get to work with, who were pulled together by a women's transportation seminar event just last year. And so I just wanted to close with a quote from Audre Lorde that I actually keep on my desk and look at almost every morning. When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I'm afraid. And that's important because I also hear my mentor telling me, you have to do the right thing even when it scares you. And then what I have learned from the women that I work with is it may be equally important to let the people that you're responsible for show you what the right thing is. So I'm going to leave you with this message: carry the torch or the paint can. You have more impact than you think. This is our latest word cloud from our latest public hearing, which turned out much better. And I would like to hand it off now to Liane.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. That was terrific, and really appreciate you taking the time to put together that presentation and sharing your perspective on women and leadership in the planning profession. So now we're going to turn it over to Liane Miller with the City of Austin. Liane, your public outreach outcomes have been so outstanding, and you've achieved a really admirable balanced engagement in your results. And so I would love to ask you how you did that, and if you could share that with us today, that would be terrific. I'm going to hand it over to you now. So Liane, take it away.
Okay, great. Is everybody seeing? You can see my screen, hopefully.
That's beautiful.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Dave. I'm really excited to be here with everyone today for International Women's Day to share how we've focused on balanced engagement in the development of our transportation plan here in Austin called the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan. And as planners, we know that feedback from public engagement directly impacts what goes into a plan. So we want to make sure that that feedback represents our community so that the plan works for everyone, including women. So the challenge that we're faced with here in Austin is that our region's population is expected to double over the next 30 years. With this growth, even maintaining current levels of traffic congestion, which, believe me, no one is happy with, will require significant shifts to using all modes of transportation, not just driving. And this seems like a fairly straightforward problem to us planners. How will we get around in the future with the growth that is projected? But we need to understand what the community hopes for in this future. And that's why we knew when we started the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan process that we needed to have meaningful public engagement for the plan and the future of transportation in Austin to be successful. We had the benefit of having a recently adopted comprehensive plan and other planning processes where we had gathered a lot of community feedback. And we are lucky that Austinites are so engaged. It's something that we hear from consultants and other planners that work in other communities. But what we recognized was that the community wasn't being equitably represented in those processes. And that was something that we set out to change with the Strategic Mobility Plan. So we've focused our efforts to elevate the voices that we typically haven't heard from. In analyzing our past engagement results, we knew that that was our youth, our seniors, people of color, and people with disabilities. And women are part of all of those groups. So to give you an idea of the tools that we've used to achieve balanced engagement, I'm going to focus on our approach during our second phase of engagement, which occurred last year. So we wanted to work with the community to explore what we get in exchange for a more diversified mode share. Currently, Austin is 74% drive alone and 26% are doing something else. In order to understand the trade-offs, we developed 3 different future scenarios made up of different mobility strategies and evaluated how well they achieved the goals of the plan. And these scenarios, A, B, and C, that you can see on the screen, A emphasized roadway projects, while C emphasized all other modes, and scenario B was the more balanced approach across all modes. And I'm just going to jump to the ending and spoil the last page of the book. We surveyed nearly 6,000 Austinites and heard from thousands of people on their preferences and collected tens of thousands of data points to inform the plan. And we were able to match our city demographics better than past planning processes. And even better, 52% of the people who took the online survey were women. So here's the breakdown of our results by survey method in that second phase of engagement. In total, we received 5,774 surveys in the spring-summer timeframe. And we had 3 versions of our online survey using MetroQuest, which I'll talk about in a little bit in the next few slides. We translated that survey to Spanish and also provided an accessible version for the blind and visually impaired. And we adapted the online survey to paper form to increase access and translated it to Spanish, Vietnamese, and traditional Chinese. And we simplified our paper survey, which you can see on the right. That's the Spanish version slightly, but it was really important that the demographic questions that we asked on the paper survey matched our online survey questions so that we could pair the results. So how did we achieve balanced engagement results? I want to go through a couple of tips that my team would recommend to other planners out there. So first, go online. With online engagement, we can get a lot of input quickly without making as much effort per input, making it very impactful to the plan. So focusing on the 3 scenarios that I mentioned before, we developed an online survey using MetroQuest. And for any of those of you who have used MetroQuest before or taken a survey with MetroQuest, there are several different screens you can choose from based on what your preferences are and your goals for your engagement. So I'll go quickly through each of the screens so that the results that I show later make a little more sense. This is the goal ranking screen, which asks participants to rank their top 5 goals from the plan. And when you clicked on each goal, you could see the definition and how well it was ranked in previous engagement phases. And their selections on this screen drove what they would see on the next 2 screens. So there was some logic involved in the survey. On the scenario screen, which came next, described each of the scenarios, A, B, and C. Those were tabs and showed how well each performed in relation to the goal rankings from the previous screen. It also included 9 performance indicators in that bottom left category, such as miles of roadway projects or access to transit, and those changed as you clicked from scenario to scenario. And participants were asked to rate these on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. In the next screen, the survey screen, participants were asked which scenario should be the starting point for the plan for Austin, what they liked about that scenario that they chose, and how would they tailor it to suit their needs. And based on their goal rankings, they could select a strategy that would best achieve the priority. So if affordability was a goal, they could say, okay, which strategy of these 5 would you think would best address transportation affordability? And then lastly, we had a wrap-up screen where we asked demographic questions and provided a link to our website. This screen was critical for tracking engagement results throughout the period of the survey was open. We asked for gender, age, race, ethnicity, and where in Austin they were. And this leads to my next tip, which is once your survey is online, monitor those demographics. Are you reaching women? Are you reaching environmental justice populations, people of color? Are you reaching across age groups? Look at your demographics early and often so that you can tailor your strategies accordingly so that you can reach specific groups that are being underrepresented. If you don't know until the end of the process, it's really hard to make changes at that point. So for the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, in addition to monitoring gender, which I showed last screen, we also tracked race and ethnicity to make sure that we reach people of color, and we tracked age to make sure that we were being equitable across different age groups, especially our 65 and older and 18 to 24-year-old age groups that have been underrepresented in past processes. Which leads to my next tip, which is because our primary survey method was online and we know certain groups are less likely to be online and come across our surveys, like our seniors, you also have to go to your audience. So, what engagement is not one size fits all. Everything that you do your engagement should be customized based on who your audience is. And a good public engagement plan considers multiple avenues for input and different types of people. So considering what types of cultural and social barriers that there might be, whether that's language, childcare needs. Clearly, that's going to be important for women. Engagement timing is a time of the day, a time when somebody could engage with you, and relationships. Who in the community do you have a relationship with that you can kind of have as a trusted person between your staff and that community. And then just thinking about the type of information that's being conveyed and who that messenger is, I think are all important in engagement. And then we also wanted to make sure that we reached our groups by doing a couple different tactics in addition to our online survey. We targeted organization and events that cater to our focus populations, picking events that have a lot of foot traffic where people may be not necessarily aware of city planning processes or not likely to come across your materials in other ways. Thinking it's really important that you should coordinate with community leaders to get recommendations on where those places are. They may not be the traditional places that we think of as planners. We also did, for the first time with this planning process, employer-based engagement to break down those traditional barriers to engaging people on the clock. This is especially important for women who are often juggling lots of priorities in their daily lives and working with their employers to allow them to engage in these processes during their workday is really important to engaging women. And then we also conducted focus groups to dive deeper with our focus populations and focused on media, which leads me to another tip, which is be social. Use social media. It's a great way to promote your online survey, and it really worked for us. But just be aware that different social media channels reach different demographics. We know that younger people are likely to be more using social media than seniors, for example. This is a study from the Pew Research Center that says, Facebook has an audience that's 61% female and Instagram reaches 59% women and more non-white groups. So just using that information as you tailor your engagement strategy. We ran paid targeted social media ads with the strategic mobility plan and reached out to media outlets that were working with our focus populations. So definitely, do your research on who those groups are before you start targeting ads. We prioritized Facebook and Instagram ads over Twitter and used Facebook analytics to tailor our ad targeting. And our designer created these beautiful, easy to engage with graphics that were simple and easy to translate to Spanish. And just a tip to make sure that when you're targeting ads, it's a delicate balance. You want to make sure that you review your data regularly to see which ads are working and which aren't. You can get the most out of the money that you're spending on ad targeting. I did want to show a couple places where I had some big jumps in online survey participants. A couple of Nextdoor was a really useful tool for us. Posts really jumped up participation, as well as one of the employers that we worked with, a local community college, sent out the survey to all of their employees and students. So that really helped also in getting the online survey filled out. And of course, all of this has a cost, which I'm sure some of you are thinking of, and whether that's in staff time or in the development of presentations and materials. And then there's the question of really how meaningful is that that effort or that cost that's being put into that engagement strategy. So this was a graphic that we developed to show how is it really worth it. And so, as you can see, our experience with digital engagement was that it was incredibly inexpensive per click, and that time and effort to engage was much lower. So it's a way for you to engage with people who don't want to or can't meet with you in person, and you can get a lot of input very quickly, making it very impactful. So not only cost effective, but helps in reaching underrepresented groups, and was successful for us in reaching women. Other efforts, while also impactful to the plan and have a lot of meaning to the community, are higher cost and require more time and effort from staff. So it's good to have a balance of all different strategies. And my last tip is mind the results. So lucky for us, we had both men and women, as well as the overall population and our focus population's preferred scenario C, which was our more multimodal scenario. So this was the clear choice for us as the starting point for the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan. We saw some minor differences when we looked across different groups. For example, between men and women, women rated scenario A a little more highly, or I'm sorry, men rated scenario A a little more highly, while women chose scenario C by a larger margin. And we saw even more pronounced differences when we looked at the goal rankings. For example, women ranked affordability more frequently than men as a higher goal. We also saw that was the case for our focus populations. Affordability was more important than some other goals. And so those are my tips for balanced engagement, but I wanted to end with one closing thought. When you're designing your engagement strategies, just really do your best to be equitable. Think about who can readily access you and who has more difficulty in doing so. Think about how you have spoken, who you've spoken to already, and where there are geographic, socioeconomic, race, ethnicity goals, holes in your engagement. And think about how you can focus your efforts to elevate the voices that you don't typically hear from. The same approach for engagement across the community may be equal, but isn't equitable. And that is it for me. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over to Dave and then to Jennifer.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Liane. That was terrific. And when I saw the results rolling in from MetroQuest for your project, I was just so curious, and thank you for sharing the tactics that you used to get that balanced participation. I think it is wonderful to know that the engagement that you did get was so representative. In fact, I went in and in looking at your demographics for your population, 68% of the population in Austin is white, and that's about what you got. So thank you so much for using those strategies and sharing them with us to get that balance. I'm going to turn it over now to Jennifer Fix. And Jennifer, you have been a bit of a trailblazer in planning for cities for women by women. And so I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about a FEMOPOLIS and what it means when planning our urban spaces. So I'm going to pass it over to you. Take it away, Jennifer.
Great. Well, thanks, Dave, for the introduction and for hosting us for this really important conversation this week. And yeah, so we've heard from Beth about cities for women, or rather cities by women. We've heard from Liane around the cities with women. and I have the pleasure today of talking a little bit about cities for women. And before I get started, I want to offer a couple of disclaimers. The first is that when we use the term women, when I use the word women, I want to acknowledge that we don't live in a world where where there's gender binary. So we know that gender is a little bit more fluid. It exists on a spectrum, and so that there's a tremendous amount of diversity even when we talk about gender itself. And secondly, I want to acknowledge that women are part of, are a very diverse group. So I'm a Caucasian woman, who's educated. I've never experienced poverty. So my perspective in terms of how I experience the city will be quite different than perhaps a woman of color, a woman with disabilities, a woman whose country of origin is elsewhere, etc. So I want to acknowledge those things before I get started. At the same time, when I want to talk a little bit about averages. So on average, people who identify as women do experience the city differently. They engage with the city differently, and they're engaged by the city differently than are men. So for example, women are more likely to experience urban poverty. Women are more likely to head single parent households. Women are more likely to shoulder the majority of responsibility in terms of domestic workload, childcare, and all of these things translate into different experiences of the city. For example, women are more likely to take more complex, shorter trips within the city than are men. And of course, our cities historically have been designed more around the commuter than someone experiencing the city with these complex trips. We also know women, for example, are more likely to experience sexual assaults and sexual harassment in the public realm. So women do experience the city differently. And yet we can ask the question, for whom have we designed our cities in the past? In 1980, an architect and professor, Dolores Hayden in the United States, asked the question in a landmark paper in 1980, what does a non-sexist city look like? And she took aim at a number of movements in the urban planning profession, but one of them that she targeted was the Garden City movement. And she was criticizing the idea that as part of this movement that families would be removed from the so-called morally dubious city centers into leafy enclaves or suburban environments, because her argument was that this move out to the country, while it was perhaps positive in terms of access to green space and nature and so forth, it also created greater isolation for women who are predominantly working at home at that time. It also created a greater workload for women with larger homes and larger yards, and it reduced her options should she choose to leave her husband, because she would have to move to another location in the city, find work, and so forth. So that was one of the first feminist criticisms of planning at the time. Now we have many promising precedents around the world where women have been the focus of the planning effort. So for example, in Vienna, gender mainstreaming, this is a policy approach that seeks to apply a gender lens to design, to urban design. And in the early 1990s, one of the female planners at the city of Vienna launched a photo exhibit called Who Owns Public Space? And she took photos of women engaging in public spaces. And this was the beginning of a series of pilot projects that were launched that were designed to simply make life easier for women. And the first of these 60 pilot projects was Frauenwerkstatt, or Women Work City. And this was designed by architect Franziska Ullmann. It's a multi-unit residential development. It's the image on the left side of the screen. It's got flat apartment layouts. They overlook a shared communal courtyard where children can play. They have an on-site kindergarten, an on-site doctor's office, and an on-site daycare. It's co-located with frequent transit, and it incorporates a very strong degree of crime prevention through environmental design principles, so ensuring that, of course, it's a safe place. This is now considered a global best practice by UN Habitat. And the city of Vienna also ushered in a whole suite of other changes around their city. They introduced new lighting, widened sidewalks, introduced ramps, and they even incorporated amenities and park spaces so that parents would be more comfortable and be able to watch their children in greater comfort. And something that was particularly interesting was that they also looked at gender at different ages. So they were observing boys and girls playing in one of their major parks, and they noted that at the age of 9, the proportion of girls playing in this park dropped substantively. And through their research, they were able to ascertain that boys were spatially asserting themselves more aggressively. And so in the competition for space, boys were winning. And so what they did is, through engagement with the girls, they came to understand would make it feel more attractive for them to play. They added more programming, such as badminton courts, more footpaths, seating, etc. And then shortly after these design interventions were introduced, the proportion of boys and girls leveled out again. That's a really interesting example. Other cities in Europe have developed handbooks around safety and crime prevention, specifically looking at gender. This is the city of Berlin. It's their handbook on gender mainstreaming and urban development, and it's required. Its application is required in all major developments. One of my favorite quotes from Brent Todderan, a Canadian planner and urbanist, is that the truth of a city's aspirations is not found in their vision statements, but rather in their budgets. And so the city of Stockholm and other Swedish cities are taking this seriously. These are screen grabs from the city of Stockholm, an educational video that looks at how they've incorporated a gender lens to their budgeting. So historically, during snowfalls, the budget, the priority was clearing highways that led to the city center, and secondly, local roads, followed by sidewalks and cycling lanes and transit facilities. When they looked at this from a gender perspective, they discovered that women were far more likely to walk and cycle and take transit, and women were less likely to travel to the central business district than were men, and were seen in greater numbers around daycares and hospitals and schools. And so then the other catch was that they discovered that in icy conditions, pedestrians were 3 times more likely to have an injury than were drivers, which of course suggests that women were more likely to experience injury during snowfalls than were men. So they adjusted their budget accordingly. They prioritized sidewalks, so pedestrian facilities, cycling facilities, transit facilities, as well as these other destinations, in order to make it more gender equal in terms of access during snowfall. I'm going to skip that because we're running short on time. The city of Umeå, Sweden, positions itself as a gender equal city, and they launched a couple of years ago the world's first Museum of Women's History. And they did so because they understood that the way we think about our history often shapes the way we think about our future. And so they launched a series of gendered landscape tours where people could tour around their city and see the city through a woman's lens. And one of the stops on this tour is this underground pedestrian connection called LEV, or Life. And it's for pedestrians and cyclists. It goes beneath a railway track, and it was deemed very unsafe by local residents for many years. So the city launched an engagement process where they brought together people across the city to have a conversation about how to make the space safer. It culminated in a redesign, which included broadening the entrances to improve sight lines and acoustics, removing hiding places, and interestingly, creating an extensive art display of light and audio, which you see here, which celebrates the contributions of one of the city's cherished female poets. And what's most interesting about this specific project is that that it incorporated the engagement, as I mentioned. And so what they did was not just create a design that was friendlier, they created a process that hosted a conversation around violence and power and gender in public space. And this is important because when we talk about issues surrounding gender in the city, we run the risk of being environmentally determinist and suggesting that design causes violence, when in fact it's not. It's patriarchy and typically men. So bringing together people around a table to talk through these issues, to build capacity around these issues, was very important, and I think relevant to the conversation we're having today around engagement. So I'll leave it there and hand off to Dave to bring this together for a Q&A and some background on MetroQuest.
So thank you so much, Jennifer. That was terrific. And to all 3 of our presenters, thank you so much for your presentations. It's thrilling for us to be involved with this kind of engagement of women. My role as a researcher brings me to many different associations where I look across so many case studies into best practices. and it really gives me a great insight into what some agencies are doing to engage diversity. And we are so thrilled at MetroQuest that our platform is being used to engage such a diversity of people in our communities and is generating changes in planning that really helps us get a lot of confidence that we're hitting on some best practices associated with making it easy to participate for a broad range of demographics. I just want to, before we open it up for Q&A, just give you a quick summary from our perspective at MetroQuest, what some of the most important factors associated with achieving balance in your public engagement are. So in terms of maximizing participation for difficult to reach people and traditionally underrepresented audiences, firstly, I'll mention time. It is so important to keep your engagement as short as possible to allow people with tight schedules to participate. So we found that about 5 minutes is about the right length of time to ask for. It's so important to be able to participate anytime you have in your schedule, and so allowing your participation to occur online on people's own schedule has been very important. Making sure that your experience is delightful on mobile is so important, and I'll show you some examples where over 50% of the online participation is occurring on mobile. So making sure that it's not only supported, but it's really nice to use online. We've got a real recognition that some people are quite intimidated by public meetings and even online forums where they can be criticized and intimidated by others. And so creating an experience that feels safe for people to express their views without fear of intimidation or bias associated with that kind of ridicule is so important. We've found at MetroQuest that it's important to weave education into the experience, and by using kind of game-like interfaces like I'll show you here, it's possible to educate people about complex planning issues and limitations and trade-offs. For example, allocating coins to a budgeting screen teaches people about limitations and scarcity, but also gets their input in a fun way. Using the scenario screen, here's an example from Jennifer Fix, who you just heard from, using MetroQuest scenario screen to look at communicating different options in the planning process and getting people's feedback on those options. And then I love these screens where people can actually pick projects to invest in, and they're given a limit of budget or number of projects. And so they, again, learn about that we can't build everything, so let's build our priority projects. It's important to use visuals, particularly when you're trying to keep it fast, but also to communicate complex issues and options around the planning process. And sometimes it's best to include some questions that just put people in the planner seat, that allow people to express where concerns are in their community by, for example, putting markers on a map. So they can nominate anything that needs changing or some of their most favorite areas in the community. As as Liane said, it is so important to collect rich demographic information so you know who you're hearing from and can monitor that participation going along with using the dashboards, and then using that process, readjust your communications process to make sure that you're getting a diversity in your participation. And then, of course, using different strategies to go to where people already are. And fill in some of the gaps in participation. So here's some examples from one of Jennifer's projects where she launched a number of campaigns where she went to events that were already taking place where there was an underrepresented demographic that she wanted to engage. So the entire process is really about generating actionable results, making sure that you have critical mass, that you have diversity, that you have informed input that you can trust, and that you have quantifiable results that you can give to decision makers to back up your assertions of what the public's priorities are by demographic group. with the hope of giving decision makers the courage to make bold decisions to build better cities that are better responsive to the needs of the entire community. I'm going to switch over now, and I'm only going to have time to show one example here, but I wanted to give you a look of what this looks like both on the back end and on the front end. So I'm going to show a quick example. So as you heard from Liane, there's a variety of different, in MetroQuest, screen types that you can pick from depending on what kind of process you're running, whether you want to use an image rating or a visual preference survey or a budget allocator or any of these other screens. What it looks like from the public's perspective is this kind of interface where you're given a welcome screen and maybe a ranking screen, which is a great question to start with. So having people rank their priorities for this project. This is Beth's project in Tampa. And then she used the scenario screen to help people understand 3 very different options, and you can see how each of them perform based on your own top priorities. And they used wonderful maps here to communicate the different scenarios. And so only after reviewing these results are people asked to say which one they like and why. And then I really like this image rating screen where they ask people to weigh in on a number of fairly complex options that that were facing the planning process, and so allow people to really understand very quickly the options that are on the table to customize their own scenarios. And then, of course, the final screen to collect people's demographic information. And as I said, and as Liane said, it's important to monitor the results. And so this particular project engaged a little over 6,000 people. You can see that over half of them participated on mobile. And what really impressed me about this particular project is the demographics of the participation because of the topic of this webinar. So looking at the age group of these over 6,000 people, a diversity of ages were represented, a diversity of ethnicities were engaged. Of course, the gender question that we're addressing today, 50-50 approximately in terms of gender. This one happened to be in the Los Angeles area, and look at the range of zip codes, including many hard to reach zip codes. And equally important, engaging people of all income levels, including this most particularly difficult to reach income level under 50,000 per household was represented in large numbers. So I just wanted to show you those examples just to get out of PowerPoint for a sec and show you some examples that make it a little bit more real for you. With that, before we go into our Q&A, I just want to open a quick poll question that asks you what additional information would be useful for you as you go through your process to try to improve your public engagement. So at MetroQuest, we have a number of things that we might be able to help you with in terms of addressing some of your questions. So we might have, you might wish to receive more feedback on your public engagement plans or approach. You might be interested in discussing any features that you're looking for in an online engagement platform. So we're happy to share with you some more details about that if you're curious to know more. If you're interested in pricing information or if you're interested in a case study, we're happy to share any of those with you. So I'll give you a few more seconds to weigh in on your poll. And if you're multitasking, please come back to your screen to answer these questions. I'll give you a few more seconds to do that, and then we'll wrap up and take your questions. So there we go. I'm going to close that. Thank you for that input. So there's so many people online today that I want to ask for your patience. We will follow up with you directly with any of that information that you've requested as quickly as possible, but please be patient because there's a lot of people online today and we're happy to help each of you. I also want to share with you in the follow-up a report that documents the findings of a recent survey we did across all of the MPOs in the country, where we're asking them about their top challenges and the strategies that they're using to solve them. There's a lot of interesting information there, so we'll share that with you. And I'm also going to share with you a recording of a recent webinar where there's an all-female planning and engagement team from CMAP, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and they got into a little bit more detail on a particular case study that I think you'll find interesting. So with that, I'm going to ask our co-presenters to turn back on their webcams, and we will take as many of your questions as possible. So let's look at these questions. So we've got a whole as I could imagine, there's a whole bunch of questions coming in. So let's start, Beth, with a question that's directed at you. Beth, if you want to have strong and effective women on your planning staff, what are some steps that you think would be most important to think about?
So a couple of thoughts. One is that I've been kind of intrigued lately by the idea of blind reviewing of resumes. So for example, there are symphonies who will only audition players behind screens, and that has tremendously allowed them to increase their diversity. They found that the folks who were making selections, we just carry around so many judgments, and it's hard for us to get over those. So one thing that I would put out there is the idea of when you get a list of resumes in, have your admin assistant number them all and take all the names off. And then just consider people based on the qualifications that you've got. And then another thing to think about is how are you empowering the women that you have on your staff right now, and enabling them to step up and take more responsibility in your organization. And are you having conversations with them about what their goals are, and helping them network and make them not only themselves but also your organization stronger by reaching out to others who are interested in the things that they're interested in and can come together to make a difference in the community.
Terrific. Well, thanks, Beth. We only have a couple of more minutes, so briefly, maybe I'll ask one of these questions that came in for Liane. So Liane, what are some engagement strategies that you feel would be particularly helpful in engaging more women in the planning process, and can you comment about any barriers that might exist?
Sure, thanks, Dave. And I think that Jennifer mentioned a couple of barriers that women just face in engaging. I think I mentioned some as well. I touched on earlier just using connections with employers, and that might be something that's new to some communities. We're used to community groups or neighborhood associations, or even PTAs, any organizations like that. But actually working with employers and finding the right contacts at those employers to kind of get your foot in the door, to give people the opportunity to engage with you while they're on the clock, whether that's showing up at their cafeteria and spending a couple of hours engaging with people while they're on their lunch break, or setting up a small focus group with a work group at that company, or asking the employer to send out your survey in their weekly newsletter. Those are all ways that then that employer is allowing women who are working and maybe have a really hard time getting all the things done in their daily lives, and just taking a 5-minute survey, while it seems small, would be another thing to add to their plate. But they really are wanting to be engaged and wanting to have input into their community. And so we see that as a way that we will continue to try to engage more and more women and people who are typically underrepresented in our engagement processes going forward, and we encourage others to try it out.
Sounds great. Well, You go for it, Liane. Jennifer, a question for you. There's so many questions. I apologize, folks, in advance. We can't get to all of them, but question for you, Jennifer. How can public engagement address some of the gender inequality in our cities that you're seeing?
It's a great question. I think, I mean, as we've seen in some of the charts shown by yourself, Dave, and some of the other presenters, engaging women online is a great way to do it. And I think when we talk about broad engagement, casting the net broadly and engaging as many people as possible online's a great way to do that. I think complementing that with some face-to-face engagement with the more hard to reach groups within the broader group of women. So for example, you know, we've worked before with sex workers, and we found that having those face-to-face conversations supplemented with that rich outcome from the online engagement side is a really wonderful way to ensure that we've captured not just broadly women, but also some of those more harder subset groups. And so hearing those voices, ensuring those voices are then integrated into the plan making process is critical to ensuring that our cities are designed for everyone.
That's terrific. Yeah, and I really respect the way that all of you have combined the online with different face-to-face strategies to offer people a range of choices of how they wish to participate and what's easy for them to do and what level of participation they want to have in the process. And so congratulations to all three of you. Thank you so much for preparing and participating in today's webinar. Really appreciate that. I'm just so thrilled to be able to do a little bit to share your success with a broader audience. With that, unfortunately, we've reached the top of our hour, so we're going to have to end it there. For those of you who are collecting AICP CM credits, there is the link for you there, but no need to scratch it down. In the follow-up email that will arrive shortly, we will send you the link so you can claim your credits directly. I want to again thank the Women in Transportation, the WTS, which actually stands for Women in Transportation Seminar, but they've evolved into so much more than that. I want to thank the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation and the American Planning Association for co-sponsoring today's webinar. Most importantly, I would like to thank our three panelists, Liane Miller, Jennifer Fix, and Beth Alden, for their presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, folks, for joining us. We're going to wrap up today. As I mentioned, we will get directly back to you with as many of the answers as we can, as quickly as we can, and also the follow-up requests that you've made for additional information. So stand by for that. Thanks very much for joining us, and take care.